Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive. Today, we're tackling a piece of history that often gets, well, kind of overlooks the 1960s Civil Rights Act.
Yeah, the one that sometimes gets lost between the more famous acts of the mid-60s.
Exactly. But trust me, this act has its own story, full of drama and surprises. We're basing our deep dive today on an episode from Mr. Hutchings History, and let me tell you, it's a good one.
It really is. So was this act a win for the civil rights movement? Or just a symbolic gesture, something for show?
That's the million-dollar question. To really grasp this act, we got to go back to the late 1950s.
Think about it, bombings of black schools and churches. It was a tense time.
Wow, yeah. It's hard to believe that was happening here in America. And the 1957 Civil Rights Act, the one that was supposed to protect voting rights, wasn't really making much of a difference.
Right, it wasn't.
So President Eisenhower steps in. But here's the thing. Eisenhower, he preferred a more, moderate approach. Did he really have the guts to fight segregation head on?
He was definitely in a tough spot.
Yeah.
You've got this escalating violence, and the 1957 Act's failing to deliver. Eisenhower knew he had to do something, but he also wanted to avoid poking the bear of the South. It was a delicate balancing act.
A tightrope walk for sure. Okay, so we have a president caught between a rock and a hard place. Let's get into the act itself. What were its main objectives?
Well, it zeroed in on two big things: obstructing school desegregation and safeguarding black voting rights. Firstly, it made messing with court-ordered desegregation a federal offense.
Ah, I see. This was a direct response to the pushback and violence after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, right?
Exactly. 1954, that landmark case that said, separate but equal, not a chance.
Right. Separate schools for black and white students, unconstitutional. But a lot of southern states weren't too keen on following that Supreme Court ruling.
Oh, absolutely not. Some were flat out defiant, using every trick in the book to stall and obstruct integration. So this part of the 1960 Act, it was like trying to give the Brown decision some teeth.
Like putting some muscle behind it.
Yeah, exactly.
So it sounds like a pretty crucial move towards equality in education. Now, what about protecting voting rights? How'd the Act try to tackle that?
Well, remember the 1957 Act we talked about?
Yeah.
The one that was supposed to deal with voting rights but was kind of weak on enforcement?
Right.
The 1960 Act tried to toughen things up. It brought in penalties for anyone trying to block black citizens from voting. And it made it mandatory for local officials to hang on to those voting records.
Interesting. So they were closing those loopholes that allowed discrimination to just slip through.
Yep, that was the idea. Create a paper trail, make it harder to sweep discrimination under the rug.
I get it. But politics, it's never that simple, right?
Nope. The Act's journey through Congress, it was a battle royale.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Deep divisions everywhere. And the battle lines, clearly drawn. Southern Democrats, super protective of states' rights, they fought like crazy to water this act down.
Wow. Can you give us a sense of, the heat of the moment?
Well, one of the loudest voices against the act was Senator Richard Russell from Georgia. He said, and I quote, "This so-called civil rights bill is a blatant attempt by the federal government to usurp the powers reserved to the states."
Wow, you can practically hear the frustration in his voice. So you have these Southern Democrats pulling in one direction and the need for civil rights legislation pulling in the other. How did they get this act through such a divided Congress?
Well, let's just say there were compromises, and some might argue a few too many.
I see.
Eisenhower, with his love for middle ground solutions, was open to negotiating. And in the end, some key parts that would give the Justice Department real power to enforce voting rights, they got weakened or straight up removed.
So even though both parties knew black voters could swing the upcoming election, they still kind of defanged the act.
Yeah, it tells you a lot about the political climate back then.
It does. It shows how powerful those Southern Democrats still were, even with the nation grappling with civil rights. It also shows the limits of Eisenhower's approach, right?
For sure. He might have seen it as progress. But a lot of civil rights leaders, they felt it was just a half measure, a symbolic gesture without much substance.
And sadly, history kind of proved them right. The 1960 Civil Rights Act, even with good intentions, it didn't pack the punch many had hoped for. Southern states, they kept finding ways to stop black people from voting. Imagine fighting for your rights, seeing this act pass, and then nothing changes.
It's heartbreaking, really. The reality on the ground was far from what the act had envisioned. Imagine you're a black citizen in the South, denied your right to vote for years. This new law is supposed to be your shield, but you go to register and bam, you're hit with a literacy test designed to make you fail, or told you haven't paid your poll tax and you can't afford it.
Ugh, that's awful.
Yeah.
It shows that laws are only as good as their enforcement. Real change, it takes more than words on paper.
Couldn't agree more. The fight for civil rights, it was far from over. In fact, those shortcomings of the 1960 Act, they fueled a whole new wave of activism, push for bolder, more sweeping legislation.
So the 1960 Act's limitations kind of lit a fire for more impactful laws. Interesting how that works.
Yeah, it's like the struggle itself shaped the movement's path forward.
Makes sense. So we've established this act wasn't exactly a runaway success, but how do historians view it today? Is it seen as a total flop, or is there more to it?
That's where it gets really interesting. Historians, they have different perspectives on this act. Some, the traditionalists, see it as a positive step, even if it was a small one, toward the feds enforcing civil rights. They argue that it laid some crucial groundwork for future progress.
Okay, so some see it as a step in the right direction, but I'm guessing not everyone's on board with that assessment.
Oh, you're right. Other historians, the revisionists, are way more critical. They say the act was more for show than substance. They point to Eisenhower's hesitation to really challenge the status quo.
So you have the glass half full folks and the glass half empty folks. Are there other viewpoints we should consider?
Oh yeah, at least two more. The legal scholars, they tend to zero in on the act's weaknesses, especially its lack of strong enforcement mechanisms. They see it as a classic example of good intentions failing because there's no real power to back them up.
I get it. It's like having a rule book but no refs to enforce the rules.
Exactly. And last but not least, we've got the continuity historians. They see the 1960 Act as a piece of a bigger puzzle, a stepping stone towards the landmark legislation that came later in the 60s.
So they see it as part of a larger arc, even with its flaws. That's fascinating.
It is. Each of these perspectives adds something to the story, helps us understand the complexities of this time in American history. It wasn't just black and white. There were shades of gray, compromises and outcomes nobody predicted.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground, but there's more to come. We've dug into the political battles, the Act's specifics, and the different opinions on how well it worked. But how did it impact people's lives? And what happened next in the fight for civil rights? Stick around for part 2 of our deep dive, where we'll explore the Act's legacy and how it connects to those big pieces of legislation from the 1960s.
We'll also revisit that thought-provoking question. If you were a civil rights activist back in 1960, witnessing the Act's limitations firsthand, what would you do next? It really makes you think about the choices and strategies people use to try and change society.
We'll be back in a flash. Don't go anywhere. And we're back, diving deeper into the 1960 Civil Rights Act. Last time, we were talking about how the act fell short in some ways and all those different opinions historians have about it. But what about the long game? Did this act, even with its limitations, help pave the way for more progress down the line?
That's the key question, isn't it? And I think it's important to remember, this act did shift things, changed how the federal government dealt with civil rights. Maybe not a total victory, but it definitely shook things up.
Okay, so what parts of the act had that lasting impact? What set the stage for change later on?
Well, making it a federal crime to, interfere with court-ordered desegregation, that was a big deal. It established a principle. The feds had a duty to step in and enforce desegregation, even if those early attempts were, well, let's just say they weren't exactly forceful.
So it set a precedent, even if it wasn't always followed right away, like planting a seed that would eventually grow into something much bigger.
Exactly. And remember that part about local officials having to keep all those voting records? That didn't stop voter discrimination right away, but it gave the federal government a way to, keep tabs on things. It laid the groundwork for future investigations and, hopefully, prosecutions.
Makes sense. So those are some concrete ways the act set the stage for progress. But I'm also wondering, how did it change the way civil rights leaders approach the fight for equality? Did the act's shortcomings force them to rethink their strategies?
Oh, absolutely. When they saw that registering black voters was still so difficult, even after the act, it became clear that these piecemeal approaches weren't enough. Leaders like Dr. King realized they needed legislation that tackled the root causes of racial inequality, not just these isolated incidents.
So it's like the act's limitations actually helped shape the movement's future direction because it showed them what wasn't working.
Precisely. And, it's fascinating to look back at those different historical perspectives we talked about and see how they view the act's long-term legacy.
Right, the traditionalists, revisionists, legal scholars, and the continuity historians. What do they say about the lasting impact?
Well, The traditionalists, they'd probably say that even with its flaws, the 1960 Act was a turning point for federal civil rights policy. They'd highlight how it set precedents and created tools that later legislation could build on.
Okay, so they see it as a positive development. What about the revisionists? Do they agree?
They might acknowledge the Act's influence in the long run, but they'd probably emphasize that it mostly showed the limits of Eisenhower's moderate approach. For them, the Act's weaknesses were a wake-up call. They showed that the feds needed to take stronger action if they really wanted to dismantle segregation and protect voting rights.
Interesting. So both sides see the impact but interpret it differently. What about the legal scholars? What's their take on the Act's legacy?
For them, it's all about enforcement. They'd argue that the 1960 Act shows us how crucial it is to have strong enforcement mechanisms. Laws are just words on paper if there's no real power behind them.
Yeah, you need those teeth we were talking about earlier. Laws need to have bite.
Exactly. And then you had the continuity historians. They view this act as part of a chain of events that ultimately led to those landmark civil rights laws of the mid-1960s. For them, it's a building block, a foundation for bigger and better things.
So even though these different perspectives might not agree on every detail, they all seem to agree that the 1960 Civil Rights Act, even with its shortcomings, played a part in shaping what came next in the civil rights movement.
Absolutely. It shows how complex these historical events can be. It's not always a simple story of success or failure, but more like a tapestry, with threads of progress and setbacks, compromises and victories all woven together.
It's a reminder that history isn't just dates and names. It's about the choices people made, the challenges they face, and the ripple effects of their actions. And speaking of choices, remember that question we posed earlier?
You mean the one about what we would do if we were civil rights activists back then, seeing how limited the Act's impact was?
Yep. Imagine being on the front lines of this movement, fighting for equality. You see this law passed, but then not much changes. It must have felt like standing at a crossroads. Do you keep pushing for small changes within the system? Or do you say enough is enough and take more drastic action?
That's a question that really gets at the heart of what it means to fight for change. And it's relevant today, too, even outside the context of the civil rights movement. How do we react when the system seems resistant to change? What strategies do we use when progress seems impossible?
Tough questions with no easy answers, but wrestling with these kinds of questions helps us understand these movements for social change and appreciate the incredible courage of those who fought for justice. And it reminds us that the fight for equality, it's never truly over.
You're so right. The legacy of the 1960 Civil Rights Act isn't just about the past. It's about the present and the future. It's a call to action, a reminder that we all have a part to play in building a more just and equitable society. And that even small steps, even steps that seem imperfect or unfinished, can help create a path toward a better tomorrow.
I like that. It sounds like we've reached a good stopping point in our deep dive for today. But before we sign off, we have one more part where we'll sum up the key takeaways and leave you with some food for thought. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
We're back. For the final part of our deep dive on the 1960 Civil Rights Act. I don't know about you, but that question we left you with has really been on my mind. What would I have done back then, knowing how things turned out?
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? To see a new law pass and then it doesn't really fix things. That must have been so discouraging for those activists.
It makes their determination even more impressive.
Yeah.
So as we wrap things up here, I think it's important to zoom out a bit, see the big picture. This act, it might not have been perfect, but it's a crucial moment in American history, right?
Absolutely. It's a story of, well, progress, but also limitations, of hopes realized and hopes postponed. But more than anything, it shows us that the fight for justice is not a straight line. It's a winding road full of surprises. Exactly. Like we've been saying all along, change doesn't usually happen overnight. It takes planning, persistence, and, being able to learn from the times you hit a wall.
Right. And sometimes, even those small steps like passing this act, they can set bigger changes in motion down the road, kind of like a domino effect.
I think that's a great takeaway for our listeners. Even when progress seems slow or incomplete, we can't give up. The 1960 Act, it might not have ended segregation, but it weakened it. It laid the foundation for those landmark laws that came later.
It's also important to remember this wasn't just about abstract ideas, legal principles, and all that. It was about real people. People denied their basic rights, facing discrimination and violence, trapped in a system designed to hold them back.
It's easy to get lost in the historical details and forget about the human cost. Behind every legal battle, every protest, every win, and every loss were people whose lives were deeply affected by this fight for equality.
And those stories, they still speak to us today. They remind us that fighting for justice, it's not a thing of the past, it's a constant process. The legacy of the 1960 Act, it's not just history, it's about today, and it's about tomorrow.
So, as we close out this deep dive, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
I hope they come away with a deeper understanding of just how complex the civil rights movement was and how complicated the legacy of this 1960 Act is. It's a story that makes us think hard about what progress really means, why it's so important to never give up, and the role we all play in creating a fairer and more just world.
That's a great way to put it. It's been amazing exploring this piece of American history. And hey, maybe this deep dive has sparked something in you. If it has, don't let the learning stop here. There are tons of books, documentaries, firsthand accounts out there waiting to be discovered.
Keep asking questions, keep challenging your assumptions, and keep searching for different perspectives. That's how we learn and grow, both individually and as a society.
That's a great point. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of the deep dive. A huge thank you to our expert for all your insights and for walking us through this complex topic. And of course, a big thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.